Today we're going to be building the market for loanable funds, which is a basic supply and demand model that helps to tell us the price at which a loan or an asset is available in the market. Before we get into the specific details of the supply and demand on this market, we're going to make one basic change to the market. We're not going to use price on our vertical axis, even though because this is a market, we are looking at the price. But as we've talked about in class before, the price of a loan is the interest rate. And in this case, we're going to focus on the real interest rate. When you are taking out a loan or when you are giving someone a loan and you are expecting payment in the future, what you care about is the real return adjusted for inflation that you are going to get over time. So what we have here is a market for loanable funds in which the commodity or the product is money that is being bought and sold in this market. So we'll start with the demand for loanable funds. The demand for loanable funds is primarily made up of borrowers or people who are seeking to borrow money. And for our purpose, that largest group of borrowers is going to be firms or businesses. And they are borrowing this money for the purpose of investment spending. So when we think about the demand for loanable funds, we immediately think about businesses trying to spend money. And as we would expect with any demand curve, the demand for loanable funds is going to be downward sloping, because a downward sloping demand curve here means that when the interest rate is relatively high, then the amount of loans that businesses would want to take out would be relatively low. At a high interest rate, people and businesses are not interested in taking out many loans. But as we lower the interest rate, we find the demand for loanable funds increases because borrowers would be more interested in borrowing money at a lower interest rate. The supply of loanable funds is primarily made up of savings. And in this case, when we think about savings, we're going to think about it coming from a few different places. The most common place we're going to think about savings coming from is individuals or households who operate as savers by putting their money into assets, into bank accounts or bonds or loans or stocks, and make their money that they're not using available. We're also going to add a little caveat here that we'll come back to later, that I like to think about the government and whether the government is running a surplus or a deficit as a type of public savings that could be occurring in the market at any given time. And of course, like most of our supply curves, the supply of loanable funds, the amount of savings that is happening in the economy, is going to have a positive relationship with our price in this case. And what we're saying there is that at a very low interest rate, we will have a low rate of savings in the economy because no one wants to save money at a very low interest rate where they're not going to gain any return. But as we raise the interest rate, people will be encouraged to save more of their money, and in saving more of their money will make more money available to borrowers. So almost every time that we are writing down our supply of loanable funds and demand for loanable funds, I encourage you to write down savings and borrowing, or savers and borrowers, as a part of this kind of model. And as in all of our models, that means that we are going to find ourselves at an equilibrium point. We're going to have a quantity of equilibrium in the market, a number of loaned dollars in the market, and we're going to have a real interest rate equilibrium in the market. For example, maybe this is a 5% interest rate that represents our equilibrium. So we find an RE, a rate equilibrium, and a QE, the quantity equilibrium in the market. One thing I always like to pause and point out here is that, as always, our quantity of loanable funds at equilibrium, I should change that to equilibrium for you guys. Our quantity of loanable funds at equilibrium is going to be where QD is equal to QS, where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. And of course, what we know is that QS, as we just said, is savings, and our quantity demanded is borrowing but we said that our borrowing is primarily coming in the form of investment spending. And so that means that at our equilibrium point, what we see is that every dollar saved is turned into a dollar of investment spending. So this QE is both the quantity of savings that is occurring in the economy, and it is the quantity of investment spending by businesses that is happening in the economy. And that's a really critical point. That is that savings investment spending identity that we've talked about that says that every time I save a dollar, I make that dollar available for someone else to spend it. And in this case, we think of that as businesses spending it. As a quick final thought about how this really is just a model like we use for supply and demand in every other situation, I want you to think about what would happen in this market if the real interest rate were set at a rate that was too low. So assume that we had a real interest rate in the market that was set at 2%, when the equilibrium rate in the market we can see is going to be 5%. What happens in this market? Well, one thing we can see happens is that the quantity demanded, the number of dollars that people want to borrow, would be very, very high, because at a very low interest rate, everyone would be interested in going out and buying a house or buying a car and demanding those loanable funds. But not many people would be interested in saving their money. At a very low interest rate, you would say, why would I bother saving my money and putting it into these assets if the assets aren't going to give me any return? And so just like in a traditional supply and demand model, we could see a shortage of loanable funds. Too much demand, too much borrowing demanded, and not enough savings available. And as in a regular market, we see that there's only one solution to this shortage. And this solution is that if we can raise the interest rate towards 5%, we will find our way back to equilibrium. We'll find our way back to a space where the number of savers in the economy increases as the interest rate goes up, because as the interest rate goes up, savers say they are more willing to save. And as the interest rate goes up, the number of borrowers begins to go down until we find ourselves to this quantity equilibrium. So those are our basics. Supply of loanable funds is made up of savers, demand for loanable funds is made up of borrowers, and they're going to find themselves at an equilibrium point where every dollar saved becomes a dollar spent. Second thing we need to do here, of course, is just practice some shifting of these models. And we're going to do this kind of 2 examples, and then you can go off and do more examples and more practice on your own later. So in one model here, we've got our supply of loanable funds, our demand for loanable funds, and we are set up at an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds and an equilibrium interest rate. In this case, we're not given what that interest rate is, but if it helps you, you can drop in a number and we can put that 5% in again. And then what we have, of course, is a factor or a shock that is going to happen to this market, and we want to know, how does that factor, that shock, affect the loanable funds market? So in this case, we see, assume that investor confidence in U.S. stocks surges. So we see investors and U.S. stocks, and in this case, investor here, that OR investor, is going to be an indicator of savers, right? This is going to be people who are buying stocks as a way to save their money. Well, what we're really saying here is that the amount of savings in the U.S. is going to increase. And as the amount of savings in the U.S. increases, the supply of loanable funds is going to increase, which means it's going to shift to the right. And so we can come to our model and we can say, well, if more people are saving money, then the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the right. People like American stocks, or they like American assets, so they start to save their money in American assets, and the amount of savings in our model for loanable funds increases. And as the amount of savings increases, we can see that now we have a surplus. We have extra loanable funds in the market at 5%. And so, of course, the interest rate in this market is going to have to decrease and maybe it falls down to 3%, and our quantity of loanable funds is going to increase. If there are more dollars available at a lower interest rate, then borrowers, demand for loanable funds borrowers, are going to say, of course I'll borrow more money at a lower interest rate. So what we can conclude is that when the supply of loanable funds increases, because savings increases, that leads the quantity of loanable funds to increase in the market, and that leads the interest rate in the market to decrease, right? The real interest rate in this market, the real interest rate in this market is going to decrease. On the other model or other example we have here, we again have our basic supply of loanable funds, our demand for loanable funds, and an equilibrium, RE, we'll set it again at 5%, and here QE, right? And this time our factor or our shock says that the new tax code implemented by the government reduces incentives for consumers to buy cars, right? And so in this case, we're thinking, okay, so people are going to be spending less money, and we know that when people buy cars, they typically need to borrow. And so if people aren't buying cars, then they aren't borrowing. And we know that borrowing is our demand for loanable funds. So if people aren't going to buy cars, then they aren't going to borrow money, and the demand for loanable funds is going to decrease. So we can grab our demand for loanable funds in this model, and we can shift it to the left to show a new demand curve. And what we see in this case is that if nobody wants those interest rates at 5%, then the market is going to be forced to push those interest rates down. Maybe they fall down to 4%. And the quantity of loanable funds is going to decrease here to a lower amount than it previously was. And so what do we get? We get when borrowing in this economy decreased, then the demand for loanable funds decreased, which led to a lower level of loanable funds in the market in general. And that happened at a lower interest rate. The real interest rate in the economy decreased because nobody wanted to borrow the money at the higher interest rate. So, loanable funds model, a basic supply and demand model in which savers and borrowers are going to interact, and in which they're going to set the interest rate in the market by using the basic laws of supply and demand to determine an equilibrium point where every dollar that is saved in the economy is going to become a dollar spent and borrowed in the economy. Use this to complete some practice problems and finish your notes, and bring all your questions back to class.